Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this spotlight session on finance for a just transition. My name is Nathalie Bouquet, and I work for the Federal Council for Sustainable Development in Belgium. This session could not be more timely. In the context of the Green Deal, the European Union is currently developing financial instruments which also have the potential to achieve a just transition. Those are the Just Transition Fund, but also private finance instruments such as the taxonomy for green financial products, the definition of a sustainable investment, indicators for do no significant harm, etc. Leaving no one behind in the green transition means that we need to strike a balance between the green and the social dimensions of sustainable development. But this is quite challenging. Green financial products may not ensure that social rights have been respected in the value chain. Social programs may be inconsistent with the achievement of climate neutrality. It's this balance we would like to focus on today whilst discussing the new financial instruments proposed by the European Commission with the great experts who will take the floor in a couple of minutes. The Federal Council for Sustainable Development of Belgium has been collaborating with the German Council for Sustainable Development on the Sustainable Finance File for a couple of years. And I'm very happy to co-moderate this session with Hanna Janecek. Hanna and I would like to warmly thank colleagues of the National Economic and Social Council of Ireland for the opportunity of this session, Jean Moore for her guidance, Sinead Niccolty and Paula Hennelly for their support, and Michiel de Vries for the coordination with the EEAC.
Yes, many thanks. Good morning also from my side. I am Hanna Janecek from the German Council for Sustainable Development. I'm gladly co-chair this session today with Nathalie. And in doing so, we have three very distinguished experts today in this session ready to provide their insights and discussion with all of us. So I'm very glad that we have Rebecca Popp with us. She's discussing the Just Transition Fund with us. She's a researcher and analyst from the strategic think tank E3G, and she focuses on just transition to climate neutrality in the European Union, in particular in the coal and industrial sector. Through her work, she aims to strengthen the role of just transition legislation in the European Union and in political processes in Germany and Central and Eastern European countries. So welcome, Rebecca. We would like to continue to introduce the other speakers and then we move right into the discussion.
Yes, Mirjam van der Stichelen is senior researcher at the Center for Research on Multinational Corporations, SOMO, in Amsterdam. She was a member of the European High-Level Expert Group on Sustainable Finance, who released in 2018 a report on the basis of which the European Commission prepared her first action plan on sustainable finance. So Mirjam is very familiar with the taxonomy regulation. She will explain us how the taxonomy intends to promote green investments and how it deals with social rights which may be affected by these investments' underlying economic activities. And our third speaker will be Robert McCorquodale, who is Professor of International Law and Human Rights at the University of Nottingham. And Robert has also a broad practical experience of business and human rights. He directed the British Institute for International and Comparative Law and contributed to the study on due diligence requirements through the supply chain of the European Commission. A possible mandatory due diligence framework is on the agenda of the Commission's renewed sustainable finance strategy, and Robert is going to explain us what it's all about.
So last but not least, we also have you, the audience, in the room, and we are very happy to have you, and we would like to make this as inclusive as possible. So please feel invited to also post your questions in the chat. We will do our very best to take up as many questions and comments as possible. If you have the feeling you have a larger comment, and we do have the time, you might even raise your hand and we can pull you into the conversation with your mic and camera. But if you do so, please always introduce yourself or mention your institution and to whom you address your question. Because we are keen on actually knowing who's in the room, I would like to ask you to go to the poll we have prepared. You find it on the right of your panel. And to kindly take a minute and click in the poll to what stakeholder group do you belong to. I hope we have everybody finding the poll. It's under polls, and then you go to the session and you click. Okay, I think we have more people in the room than we have votes at the moment. So I'll give another second for everybody to vote. I do see a majority at the moment for Sustainable Development Councils. We have government representatives. Okay, we have a share of all stakeholders in the room. That's good to know. Maybe least the civil society at the moment. If they are not, there are some voices coming in. Okay, let's see. I'll have a look at it later, maybe again. So we have Sustainable Development Councils leading and a fair share of all others. So let's move to the first topic, the Just Transition Fund. So the EU has proposed the Just Transition Mechanism, a key tool to ensure the transition to climate neutral economy in a fair way and to leave no one behind. It provides a targeted support to help mobilize at least 150 billion euros over the next 7 years. The tool contains 3 pillars: the Just Transition Fund, the InvestEU scheme to mobilize investments, and also the public sector loan facility. These 3 pillars are a massive program in themselves to stimulate green transition and make it socially just. Today, we will only look at pillar 1, which is the Just Transition Fund, which is complex itself enough. So the potential of the Just Transition Fund is within the territorial Just Transition plans, which can be developed by the member states in the coming years. And they are meant to socially support areas to provide economic conversion and diversification and land restoration. So I'm very happy to have Rebecca here today. She's an expert. She has done extensive research in multiple countries in the European Union, and I'm happy to hear about you. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hannah. Okay, perfect. I see Jonathan is actually sharing my slides. Yeah, thanks for giving me the opportunity to participate in this interesting session. My name is Rebecca Popp. I work for E3G. We are an independent climate change think tank. We have offices in London, Berlin, Brussels, also Washington, and staff in some other countries worldwide. Hannah, you've already introduced the Just Transition Fund. I think it's probably an instrument of transition financing that got most attention this year. So I will dive into it a bit further with all of you. And during the presentation, the central question, oh, you can still go back to the first slide. So during the presentation, the central question that I would like you to keep in the back of your head is whether the Just Transition Fund can support the EU's just transition to climate neutrality, or whether it might only cement the status quo and even hinder a just transition. So yeah, next slide, please. Before going into the details of the fund, I would just like to give you a bit of political context or the political setting that this proposal was introduced in. So it's very clear that the EU is committing to increase climate action. The Commission presented the European Green Deal as the new growth strategy. At the moment, an increased climate target for 2030 is being debated. And all this means that we will see profound changes in all sectors of the economy. And of course, the energy sector is one of the sectors that are quickest to decarbonize. So for example, if we look at scenarios for the new 2030 target, we see that coal must be almost non-existent in the EU's energy mix by 2030. And if you look at this picture, you see a lot of green, primarily in the west of Europe, and you can see that many countries already plan to phase out coal by 2030, but then again, there's also some red spots, and some countries are still planning to use coal beyond 2030, and they are mostly located in Central or Eastern Europe and include some of the main coal producers. So the Just Transition Fund is basically there to help the remaining countries catch up in this transition to climate neutrality. Next slide, please. Hannah has already said that it is one of 3 pillars of the Just Transition Mechanism. The Just Transition Mechanism is an instrument of the European Green Deal Investment Plan. The other 2 instruments, so it's an investment scheme under InvestEU, which aims to leverage private investment. Then there's a public sector loan facility under the European Investment Bank, which aims to mobilize public investment. And then there's the Just Transition Fund, and it really received most attention because this is about grants. So it's not loans, it's about grants that member states get, and it was also, or it is a key piece in the negotiations on more climate ambition in the EU, because initially it was introduced also in an attempt to convince those more reluctant countries to commit to an EU-wide target of climate neutrality by 2050. As the Just Transition Fund stands at the moment, Poland, Germany, but also Romania would receive the largest share of it. If you could please go to the next slide, Jonathan. So I want to look a bit with you at the cornerstones of the Just Transition Fund, its value added, and also some of the problems that I currently see. So what is very positive is that the fund provides transition support beyond the coal sectors. So for example, industrial regions in the European Union can also benefit from the funding, like a steel region in Italy, for example. And that's really important because a just transition is not only needed in the energy sector, but also in other sectors of the economy. Another positive element is that the Commission proposed very clear exclusion criteria for fossil fuels, as well as nuclear for nuclear in its proposal that it introduced in the beginning of the year. And then Hannah already mentioned the regional transition plans that member states have to develop to access the funding from the fund. And I think they are the key element of the fund, or the value added, because the need to develop these plans has already started transition debates and planning processes in regions where these debates were previously non-existent. It also gives like a clear process to, it sets up a clear process that stakeholders can engage with, so civil society, local authorities, for example. So that's very important. On the other hand, the Just Transition Fund, as it currently stands, also has major weaknesses. So at the moment, the funding will not be tied to very strict climate conditionality. Heads of state and governments have proposed, for example, that 50% of a member state's share will be made conditional to committing to the Union's target of climate neutrality by 2050, but this actually only affects Poland. And other aspects, for example, support for an increased 2030 target or a commitment to a coal phase out, are not yet conditional to get a share of this fund. So these conditionalities would be needed to ensure that countries receiving the funding really commit to the transition and not just fund fund a status quo. So at the moment, it doesn't really incentivize climate ambition. And then maybe you've heard of it. So there's also a risk that some of this money might be invested in natural gas. So for example, the European Parliament is at the moment pushing quite strongly to include these investments. Jonathan, can you move to the next slide, please? So I want to take a quick look with you at what is next for the Just Transition Fund, because it's not adopted yet. And there are two things I would like you to take away from this timeline, and I hope you can all see it on your screen. But most importantly, at the national level, member states have already started to draw up these regional transition strategies. So this means there is an opportunity to engage in these processes and to shape how these transition plans for individual regions look like, what priorities they set for the funding from the Just Transition Fund. And then secondly, at the European level, there are at the moment negotiations taking place between the Parliament, the Council and the Commission, so the trilogues over the design of the fund. And this is another opportunity to shape a strengthened climate conditionality of the funding to ensure that investments in fossil gas, for example, are excluded from the fund. And again, to come back to the question that I posed at the beginning of the presentation, having this very strong criteria for the funding is crucial to make sure that the Just Transition Fund can actually boost the just transition to climate neutrality in the EU. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. That was a very concise overview. Thank you for this. So far, we don't have any questions in the chat. So if you have questions to Rebecca, please feel free to raise them now. In the meanwhile, I'll take the liberty to ask you another question, because I'm curious, like through the COVID-19 pandemic, we have witnessed in the past weeks a massive program, the EU Next Generation program and the National Recovery and Resilience Facilities. And I would be interested about your opinion, how these two get together, or if there's something in construction of these two plans that we need to do to get right in the coming months at national level. And what is your opinion on this?
Yeah, sure. So under the instrument that you mentioned, the Recovery and Resilience Facility, the member states have to draw up national recovery plans in which they outline investment priorities and to overcome the economic downturn from COVID-19. And at the moment, it's actually not clear how these recovery plans will be aligned with the regional transition plans that I mentioned earlier. So it's not clear yet, even though there are very strong links. But what we do see already is that many member states, of course, prioritize the national recovery plans, because this is about much more money than the Just Transition Fund. And this means that there's a certain delay with the regional transition strategies. And I expect the development of these strategies to go into the beginning of next year as well. But yeah, I do see how these the regional transition strategies can become very relevant for the recovery, because I mean, what countries do and together with regions in these strategies is to outline strengths and weaknesses of the region, potential future development pathways, and that can actually help to make these regions more resilient. It can help to also identify areas for investment and acquire additional financing. So they do have a very important role in the recovery, but of course, there needs to be stronger alignment between all the different plans that member states have to draw up now.
Yeah, thank you. So Natalie, how are we in time? Because I see 2 questions in the chat now, and we have a comment regarding an interesting publication, which we will certainly take up. Thank you, Mr. Kramer, for this. Maybe I raise one question to Rebecca, and then we continue with the other speakers.
Yeah, sure.
So we have, I start with the first one and I keep the second one maybe for later. So the first one is that you mentioned the fund is also for local authorities. Are they dependent on the member state to get part of the fund, or are they able to apply directly for the fund?
Okay, so the process, how the plans are drawn up and the funding is distributed is the same as for all other EU funds. So there are in each member state so-called managing authorities. This can be, for example, a ministry for EU funds that are in charge of developing the programs that money from the EU budget is spent on. So if someone is interested in engaging with or having a say over the money from the Just Transition Fund, this means engaging with these managing authorities. And then the process for actually developing these transition plans is different in each member state. So it's the role of the national government to set up these processes, to, in some cases, they delegate it to regional governments, for example. That's the case in Germany and Poland. The regional governments also have a very strong say. So that's where also local stakeholders can come in. The process needs to stick to the partnership principle that is applies to all cohesion funding from the European Union. So relevant stakeholders need to be consulted in the development of these plans. But yeah, it's a problem that there's no guaranteed access for local authorities, for example. So that's also something that we are emphasizing in our communication around the fund, because the local level is really crucial for the just transition.
Absolutely, yeah. Especially when it comes to acceptance of the results. Yeah. Okay, many thanks. We have one more question. I keep it here. It's not forgotten. We will come back to this later, but we move now on to the financial sector and how it can contribute to the just transition. So Natalie, over to you.
Yes. In addition to what the Just Transition Fund can achieve, we can indeed wonder if the financial sector can also contribute to just transition and what we could do for this to happen. How could private investments be consistent with the achievement of the objectives of the Green Deal, while ensuring at the same time that green investments are not made at the expense of social and workers' rights? There's no doubt that just transition is also based on institutional and private capital, because it's the same capital that is mobilized for the green transition, in addition to public funding. For example, all the estimates of the investment needs for climate policy report that public sector resources will not be adequate to meet the challenge. So the question that we can now ask ourselves is how to ensure that institutional and private investments in green economic activities do no harm social objectives. And we are continuing our session with keynote inputs from Mirjam van der Stickelen and Robert McCorkodale. Mirjam, you have the floor.
So I will try to explain how the European Union since 2018 has been trying to promote the private sector's investment. And I say investment, and it doesn't apply to the banks for the moment, so not for the loans, so keep that in mind. And they had proposed 3 kind of sustainable finance laws in 2018. And one of them is very much being discussed, and it's about what is called a taxonomy. And just for people who think, what on earth? This means basically we have to know what is it when we say it's a green investment or it's a climate mitigating investment. We have to be very clear. And one of the purpose of this law was to stop and avoid what is called greenwashing, which means that, you know, if an investor comes with you and says, you know, this is kind of good for climate, what are the guarantees that it's going to be the case? So the taxonomy regulation, it's a regulation, came finally into force in July this year. And you have to bear in mind the taxonomy law, the regulation is a framework law, which means it sets also the processes to further define all kinds of activities. So I will try to explain that for the moment, the current framework taxonomy regulation is about especially dealing with environmental, what they call environmental sustainable activities. So it doesn't assess, you know, the company or whatever. It's about what activities are being invested in, and it has 6 kind of categories, if you want. One of them is to define what is climate change mitigation activities, what are climate change adaptation activities, and then that's the 2 first ones that they have been focusing on. I will come back on it. And then you also have 4 other ones, the one being sustainable use and protection of water and marine resources. The next one is the category of transition to a circular economy. The 5th one being pollution prevention and control. And the 6th one being protection and restoration of biodiversity and ecosystems. And the reason why I'm calling them is because what the framework law is saying, if you say you are contributing to one of these categories, that's fine, you focus on it, but you should not do significantly harm to the other ones. Yeah. And then the question is, as Nathalie already said, what happens with kind of social aspects? So there is indeed a minimum guarantees on social aspects being included. And they are in kind of laid out in very general terms. They say you have to be aligned, the activity has to be aligned with the OECD guidelines on multinational enterprises, with the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, on the labor rights set out in the core labor ILO conventions, and the International Bill of Human Rights. So there is a guarantee that, you know, at least there should be paid attention that these kind of basic social and human rights are not being violated. However, as I said, the taxonomy regulation is a process. And these definitions, these 6 categories, have to be worked out much more. And I will explain that in a minute. But the problem is with these minimum safeguards, there is nothing to kind of really work them out much more. Yeah. There are kind of no delegated acts. So it's no kind of technical instruments to deal with them and to make sure how exactly do you do it. And that contrasts with what is now happening with the first 2 categories, so climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation. Those kind of categories have been divided in 8 categories and in kind of 8 sectors like transport, manufacturing, water, and even there on agriculture. And even in those sectors, there have been now definitions being defined. You know, what does it mean if you are climate mitigating in transport, or when you are doing forestry, etc. I mean, there is a current now the proposal of about 500 pages, what exactly it means. Yeah, and that's a delegated act. The Commission is going to decide by the end of the year on those details. But still, there's very little on what is happening then. What does it mean with the social minimum safeguards? And that's a concern. But at least there's some framework there. There are 2 other ways where that can be detailed much more, because the taxonomy regulation also has created a platform for sustainable finance with all kind of stakeholders, and they can then define, make more kind of explanations. The second thing I wanted to cover is that, as you could hear, the categories currently covered are dealing with environmental sustainability. But there was already protests, and I can say I pushed on it. We want to have also a social taxonomy that defines when you say you're contributing socially, that it is clear and you're not red washing or whatever you call it. And ideally, you have a sustainability taxonomy where you social and environment are basically together. There is a possibility that a social taxonomy can be introduced because the regulation is saying when we review it, and the Commission has made a report by the end of next year, so by December next year, the Commission can propose the introduction of a social taxonomy. And the new commissioner, I don't know if you know, but we have a new commissioner to deal with finance regulation, Merit McGuinness. She has said in her hearing in September that she's in favor of it. So, and I know that in the platform there are some members who have expertise and are willing to do so. So that's an important one to keep in mind, that it is possible. What I would like also to emphasize, and probably to kind of finalize with it, is the taxonomy is providing definitions what is good, not what is bad. So it doesn't forbid what is actually environmentally harming, what is climate change. That's a big problem. And we call that a brown taxonomy. So we're also calling for a brown taxonomy. The taxonomy and the definitions don't have to be used by investors, except they have to be used by governments when they are initiating standards, for instance, a green bond standard. Then it has to be used, even if you're not obliged to use the standard. But I think it's important because what we just heard before, I was just wondering whether in the Just Transition Fund, basically, it seems that taxonomy should be used, because that's kind of an obligation there. So, and secondly, the member states weren't kind of too happy that there was a platform on sustainable finance with all kind of stakeholders, and they wouldn't be involved. So they also have what is called an expert group of the member states. The exact name is, let me see, we want to have a platform on sustainable finance and kind of a member states expert group. They want to check what the platform is going to bring out. And I think also for the regional councils, it might be interesting who in your ministries is sitting in that kind of expert group and deals with the definitions. So that, there is kind of a way to have a feeling where we go, where is the balance. There's a huge amount of lobbying going on. The financial sector is not happy that there are these very strict definitions. There's pressure for gas, nuclear to be part of the definitions and so on. So it would be interesting as well for the council to be there. One other aspect that I wanted to raise is that there are, as I said, there are 3 different sustainable finance laws for the moment. The second one is about disclosure when an investment is being made and when it says it's sustainable. Yeah, then it has to kind of say yes or no whether it's going to use the taxonomy. And thirdly, the problem is that a lot of companies are not providing a lot of information that is needed. Yeah, they were supposed to disclose it in the non-financial reporting directive, but that's not enough. So the taxonomy regulation has now obliged companies to say whether or not they are having activities according to the taxonomy. And the reason why I mention it here is that when you will have companies coming to you, to supply services or whatever, you should be able to ask them, and it's not applicable yet, but in the future, you should show me the financial report. And then you can see whether or not they are using strict definitions of what they say is green, the taxonomy regulations. So I think that's where I wanted to up. So the problem is the taxonomy, you don't have to use it except for the governments. And even there is now a big debate going on the EU green bond standards. The EU social bond standard is now in the hands of the industry, as far as I can know. But so there's lots of discussions and I think opportunities for debate and to contribute to the development of a strict kind of social standards. Thank you.
Natalie, you're on mute.
Natalie, we cannot hear you.
Okay, is it okay now?
Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much for this very clear presentation of the taxonomy. I noted your reference to the obligation of companies to disclose the percentage of the activities that comply with the taxonomy for investors, but I have also noted that in the measures and penalties article of the taxonomy regulation, there is no enforcement measure to that obligation, in contrast to the disclosure obligation of investors. So I find that is a bit striking. And in the same vein, I would like to ask you regarding this Article 18 with the minimum safeguards you referred to in the first part of your presentation. It's the wording of this article which is striking to me, beside the fact that there is no process to implement it, in contrast to the definition of substantial contribution. That's really the wording, because the article says that minimum safeguards are procedures implemented by an undertaking to ensure the alignment with the OECD guidelines, the UNGPs, etc. And in my understanding, procedures to ensure reflect an obligation of conduct of undertakings, not an obligation of result to comply with the UNGPs. And even if there was an obligation of result, the UNGPs are soft law as long as states have not implemented the third pillar on access to remedy. So I would like to know if you are in favor of more hard law provisions to ensure investors' compliance with these minimum safeguards.
Sorry. Sure. And of course, the problem is also that there is a huge discussion going on how you will quantify or how to verify. So what you are referring to is very often procedures means, are there policies in place? And policies can be one, but we at SOMO, we do a lot of research on the ground, and we uncover lots of things that are never and nowhere in somewhere written and so on. So there is a huge lack of information about what is really happening on the ground. Very often difficult to verify, even social audits and so on can be wrong. But I also, actually I pushed on it to make sure that there is the International Bill on Human Rights is there as well. And of course, I mean, it's still at the international level, it's difficult to do so. But I think it's important that there should be hard law and at least kind of, well, I think the OECD guidelines say at least you apply the national legislation. But yeah, it's a concern that it is so weakly worded, and then and even the enforcement is going to be difficult. Except one thing I wanted to say is that the Commission finally is convinced that it has to review the non-financial reporting directive, which means they can then reinforce the enforcement of that reporting. Because when I was first asking who is following this up, nobody knew, and it's basically the financial authorities, the financial market authorities who have to follow up. But actually also we were going to go and find out, but we have no clue how much kind of capacity they have to kind of follow up. But it seems that now there's so much complaints about the fact that there is not enough information by the companies. So all the investors say we cannot know. There's a whole ESG industry, as I call it, ESG ratings, which everybody complains is absolutely incomplete, doesn't kind of give a good clue, is very diverse for the same company. And the Commission is also going to work on that one to regulate that industry and to basically trying and set that all the information is being put in one what do you say, kind of database, public database. But that still means disclosure, and it doesn't mean enforcement. So yeah, I agree. There's lots of things to do.
And there is also maybe a need to focus on the business beside the activities themselves.
Yeah, so that's what hopefully that the non-financial reporting directive will help with the amendment that is being done, because they have to give some kind of percentage. But it's the same problem with the green bonds or the social bonds. You only look at the activity and you don't look at the issuer. And that's been a big debate that we actually lost so far. But there are more and more instruments coming that can be used to have a more comprehensive view.
Precisely.
And I think the next speaker will also say something
Yes.
like the due diligence is also a part of it.
Yes, indeed. So we have a reference to the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, the UNGPs, in the taxonomy regulation. And human rights due diligence of business enterprises to prevent adverse human rights impacts of their activities is one of these principles, the UNGPs. And it includes the protection of the fundamental rights at work of the International Labour Organization. Robert, as one of the authors of the famous study of the European Commission, can you expose the findings of this study?
Thank you very much, Natalie. Jonathan, you've kindly got, there we go. So just to give a little bit of background, I am a professor of international law, but also I have done a lot of work with companies, with international organizations, with civil society on these issues. And in fact, I have a consultancy on this. So, and I'm a practicing lawyer. So these issues are very interesting for me in the sense to which we can regulate on them. And the context for the question of Natalie is, Jonathan, if you could change the slide, please, that the EC, the European Commissioner, made the statement in April 2020, so just earlier this year, that the EU would bring in legislation by early next year to cover issues of the three issues he's got there, of to foster long-term horizons in corporate decision-making, to incentivize sustainable business models, and to increase corporate accountability for human environmental harm. I'm going to look at the last one, but I should also add that they're looking at changing directors' duties, and also made it very clear that in his talk that part of this was on the basis of the Green Deal and the taxonomy, which Miriam's already mentioned. Next slide, please. So I was a co-author of a long study, I wouldn't encourage you to read all pages of it, in which we examined whether or not a part of it was, do business actually want these kind of regulation in the EU? And I have to say I was somewhat surprised by this answer, not completely, because I've worked in this area and know that a lot of business want it, but 631 survey respondents and almost 80% are saying, yes, we want legal certainty about our human rights and due diligence obligations. If you could go to the next slide, please, Jonathan. So what we also see in this slide is a little bit more complex. If you look down the bottom, it looks at 4 areas and asks the question, do you think there should be a EU level standards? Interesting, the first question of, should the EU provide a single harmonized standard? And the significant answer was yes. And that's quite interesting, that there's a sense of level playing field. Business wants regulation. So although you'll often hear some business organizations who are meant to represent business saying, oh, we're anxious of this, time and time again, my work shows that business wants clarity in this regulation, and they want regulation where they realize they have benefits. And in fact, the study showed that it enhances competitiveness, enhances innovation if there's clear regulation. Plus, it means that those who are perhaps the leaders are not disadvantaged by those who are maybe getting a contract because they're using child labour. Next slide, please. So just to put in context, if the EU brings in this legislation, it is not out of keeping with where the whole move has been in the last few years. I've got there highlighted some areas where there's actual clear regulation, such as, for example, the United Kingdom Modern Slavery Act, in the USA, the California Transparency in Supply Chain Act, in Australia, the Modern Slavery Act, in South Africa, the Black Economic Empowerment Act. These are existing laws which are developing. And Miriam's already mentioned the non-financial reporting directive in the EU, but of course the non-financial reporting directive, although it's implemented across all of the member states, it doesn't include within it any liability for companies who aren't doing this properly. Okay, next slide, please. So Natalie has already mentioned the context of this. In the context of our survey, the context of the decision by the European Commission has been the development under the UN Guiding Principles on Business of Human Rights of the notion of human rights due diligence. It's also been taken up by the OECD. So what does that mean? Essentially, there's just four things it means. Assess. You firstly have to, every company has to assess the actual potential human rights risk, which usually means to undertake an impact assessment. Secondly, it means to take action to operationalize the findings. So it's not just about talk, it's about action, and also track the effectiveness in your actions, in your supply chain, all the rest of it, and communicate how they've been addressed. Next slide, please. Just to be clear on what it is and what it isn't. Many of you will be familiar with business due diligence, which is, let's say, something that a company is going to take over another company. They check that the liabilities are all done. It's about risk to the business. It happens one-off, and often it's about a CSR issue. That is not what human rights due diligence is. Human rights due diligence is what a reasonable and prudent enterprise needs to undertake. It's about a process, but also about a standard of care. So it's beyond just the usual tick box kind of process. And above all, the focus is on the impacts to the rights holders. So that's where you start. Rather than starting with the impacts to the business or the risk to the business, you start with what are the impacts on the right holders, and then you look back, you look then the consequence of business. And those impacts are determined by what a business has or may cause or contribute through its activities, and how it is directly linked to its, say, suppliers, where they are causing impacts. Now, it does accept there's differences depending on the size, the area of operation, but it does make it clear it's ongoing. So all of these makes it a different approach than ordinary business due diligence. Next slide, please. So what does this all mean? Well, what's been interesting is, first, you make clear it applies to all companies, no matter what size. It applies, for example, to parent companies. I was involved in this case, which came before the UK Supreme Court, Vedanta and Langawi, where it was made very clear parent companies have a duty of care to their subsidiaries, even though subsidiaries, like in this instance, are in another state. But it also applies to financial institutions. Initially, a number of the banks said, no, we might be directly linked, but we could never cause or contribute to it. But the case law and the clarifications have made it very clear that is not the case, that in financial institutions can cause and contribute to human rights impacts. There's a case against the Norwegian Pension Fund where the National Contact Point made that very clear. There have been cases against banks. I mean, there's even instances where, for example, ING, Dutch financial institution, they made clear that they had a consequence. And ESG issues, for example, there's a case against Chiquita in the United States where they'd made a very clear statement, and then they were being sued on it. So it's certainly applies to financial institutions and also possibly the public sector. Australian Modern Slavery Act makes that clear. And it applies along the supply chain. Now, clearly, it's hard to apply beyond the first tier, but the intent is that it should do so. It also applies to all rights holders, workers, local communities, consumers. Now, that's quite important in terms of just transition, because the just transition, largely, they're not solely, but largely when it talks about social rights, it means labour rights. But this is not just about labour rights. It extends beyond that to local communities and others. And the EU one applies to environment, which the UN one does not. The UN one is only about human rights due diligence. What is interesting about the EU potential regulation, it applies to the environment, though it's not clear whether it only applies to the environment where there's a human rights consequence. So where a dam breaks with humans having a consequence rather than just the environment by itself. It also does not at the moment expressly include climate change. I suspect that might change, but currently it does not. And I think that's a concern because I feel that it's necessary to make that statement. And that would fit much better with the just transition and various other discussions, which such as on taxonomy. And in terms of liability, human rights and environmental due diligence by themselves don't create liability. They are a means to deal with the impacts and the consequence of the impact. But separately, there is liability. And the discussion seems to be there are three kinds. Civil liability, so where a victim might be unable to sue a company for action which impacts on them. Criminal, where the government brings an action, though of course that by itself doesn't give a remedy to the victim. And administrative, some form of public supervision. Now, this is important because a lot of the laws so far are simply reporting, and reporting evidently does not make a change. In fact, the German government showed a survey which proved this. So I suspect there will be some form of regulator. There's also an issue potentially of a defence to a company, which a company could say, listen, I did reasonable and appropriate human rights and environmental due diligence. And so that's a defence. So the huge upside on this is human rights and environmental due diligence would make obligations on business much clearer. Final slide, please, Jonathan. So what does this mean? I think it means that corporations need to make sure they are serious about having a policy which is operational. And I've worked with enough companies to know there's a difference between a policy at the top end and actually what happens in the operational stage. And I think that it's important to make sure there is a policy, it's adopted, and there's systematic change, and deal with actual and potential impacts. Recognizing it applies to subsidiaries and in value change. So it's not just one's own actions, but it's linked actions too. For investors, I guess my experience is be well informed about what actually the company you're investing in is actually doing, not just what it's saying it's doing. And look at what they're mitigating. Are they putting in place good consultation with stakeholders on the ground? Do they have an operational grievance mechanism process? And is that effective? And also think about, it's not just about disclosure, it's also about your own actions as an investor internally and potentially in your investment choices. And finally, governments are going to perhaps introduce it in public procurement as requirements and of course their own activities. And the role of civil society is very important, and a lot of case law is brought from that. So I think what I see in this is if the EU brings in this regulation, which seems highly likely, they've just introduced a consultation on it yesterday, which will last till February. My feeling is when they bring in this regulation, it'll make a significant difference in terms of companies' actions in this area and requirements. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert. There was an interesting question in the chat, I think, just after Miriam finished her presentation. And this question was raised by Andreas Kramer. And he says that bond rating agencies and providers of second-party opinions on bonds will look at the initiators and insurers, as well as the activities to be funded. So it's true that there is a focus of investors and rating agencies on the company, on investor, in addition to the activities of this company. But I think, Robert, you explained very well that there are different ways to look at a company, and you can wonder if the company reports correctly, but you can also wonder if it is acting correctly. And I think maybe you provided by explaining that a response to the question by Andreas.
Thank you. I think the question from Andreas is a good one. I think that their role, their requirements are more than they used to be, and not just thinking, oh, but well, let me give you an example. Let's say that a investor thinks, oh, well, we will fund X, and thinking that X company is going to do very well, but they don't look at things like, well, maybe they're doing well because they've got child labour. And it's no good just saying, we're not going to look beyond that. We're just going to look at whether or not there's a return on investment. I think that point is a real risk to investors and others when they're considering the consequences of such regulation.
Can I say something on that as well? Because I think it's fine that they are doing it. But the question is whether there is a legal obligation. And for the moment, there is also a problem that the rating agencies themselves and also the verifiers are not being regulated. There's even no kind of minimum safeguards, and there's no supervision of them. And I think that's something that the Commission is now looking at as well, because that's good for them also to have like a standard procedure, so that indeed, for instance, they are obliged to look at the whole company in a certain way, that we have at least some guarantee that's in a good way to look at the company together with the activities.
Excellent point, Miriam. And I think it is a problem. And also there's no coherence yet on what ESG might require, because there's different kind of approaches on that. And
exactly,
often yes is completely ignored in that. So that's an excellent point. Thanks, Miriam.
Yes, and I would also like to ask you a further question, Robert, because the Commission study you participated to reports that the option for mandatory due diligence framework has higher costs impacts on companies than, for example, just reporting on due diligence. So how could we best address this finding of the study?
I think that's a good point, that the finding did say there'd be more costs for companies if they adopted fully the due diligence. But I think there's also the balance that there are costs of not doing it. A survey showed there's something like $20 million a week, which is lost on companies not taking account of community concerns, of employees' concerns. And I think they are a real risk. We see that, for example, in at the moment with Qatar, where employees haven't been paid, and that immediately stops the various stadia that they're building. So I think that there are direct consequences if companies don't act, which have costs, real costs. So yes, undertaking mandatory human rights due diligence will have a cost, but it will often save other costs. And plus, just to add, there's two other costs which are often ignored. One is a reputational cost, and I think that's a real issue which is often ignored in the sense that investors take into account, how do we see this company, and I think that's an issue, and also litigation costs, which can be, for some companies, significant.
Thank you.
All right, I think we are already in the middle of the panel discussion. And I think it's quite a breadth we are covering here today. So we try to tie it together a bit. There are questions in the chat, like one is left for Rebecca, I'll put up later. But maybe to give it a start now to interact among all of us. Like if you consider your topic and the high ambition of the Green Deal in the European Union, where would you see is the largest potential or the largest obligation at national level to really boost what is the intention of the program, be it the Just Transition Fund or be it the taxonomy? Maybe if you just can pick one potential or obligation that you would say is of top priority to make this a success. Who wants to go first?
I'm happy to go first, but I hope I understand your question correctly. But where I certainly see the largest potential at national level now to achieve the objectives of the European Green Deal is clearly the recovery funding. So at the moment at EU level, but also at national level, massive sums of money are being made available to support the recovery from COVID-19. And I mean, this money will put all member states on a path for the years to come. So this money needs to be spent in a good way. And that means that the governance of this money needs to be very strong to make sure it's spent on the right things. And yeah, that's basically, I think, a key lever at the moment.
Okay, maybe just, Miriam?
Yeah, I was thinking that I'm quite amazed to hear that apparently the whole taxonomy definitions are not being discussed in the fund, because it seems to me that when a government is going to implement recovery activities or also issue green bonds, that they are using the definitions of the taxonomy. So it's clear that it really contributes to climate mitigation and climate adaptation. I think that would be very important. And secondly, it is costly as well, unfortunately, because it's cheaper now to have brown activities funded than the green ones. So I would say the support of governments to kind of help to define and help businesses to kind of be really aligned with those very strict climate change mitigation activities would be important. And they can put it probably as a conditionality for some of the funding, but at the same time support those who want to align with it to help them to really kind of go to it, because the details are quite complex. And I would say also at the national level, check with the ministries who are sitting in this expert group on sustainable finance, that they are pushing in the right direction at the EU level.
And I would just add in area that I covered, I think there'll be two impacts. One on domestic law in order to begin to build up a greater domestic understanding of this. I mean, already there's the French law on the duty of vigilance. And I think that's one example. And I think it's led to, for example, the UK introducing a bill on deforestation and what that means in terms of what companies can and can't do. And I think that's one impact. there's a bigger impact, which is at the same stage as a treaty being discussed, in fact, this very week. And there might be some impact on that. In fact, the part of the debate is, does it include environmental impacts? Thank you.
And can I ask one question to Robert? Because it seems to me that when a social taxonomy is going to be developed, due diligence should be part of it, or at least reference to the EU law.
I agree. Absolutely agree. But also recognizing that part of it is labour rights and part of it are other human rights. So it's not just a labour rights issue.
Yeah, sure.
I would like to add something to this discussion, because I think that Miriam, you explained that a whole process is ongoing regarding the green dimension of the taxonomy. There is a mandate for delegated act to also for the supervisory agency to define a lot of aspects relevant for the taxonomy. But I think that even for the green dimension of the taxonomy, due diligence is relevant, not only for the social aspects, because it adds an additional layer of responsibility.
I mean, basically, the Commission wanted to make sure that, for instance, the disclosure legislation, which is there on sustainability, was not only about disclosure, but also that you have to do it. And actually, the disclosure is already giving a lot of details what you should do in your disclosure, basically suggesting what you should do. And I haven't followed up how much they are kind of through delegated acts trying to make sure that lots of investors are doing it. And at the same time, yeah, the big question is how far are the banks and their lending going to be obliged to do so? But I agree. I mean, it's really, you know, where will be the obligation to kind of really, well, do the assessment and use the kind of the green definitions. There's too much greenwashing still going on, too little money going the right direction.
And there is also the fact that the delegated act on the taxonomy will reflect a political choice. For example, we have this discussion about nuclear, about solid, about fossil fuels, not solid, but the other ones. So the taxonomy is not a scientific database. It's
supposed to be, because that's what the regulation says. But indeed, there's huge debates going on, to put it nicely, gas and nuclear. Yeah, unfortunately, but at the same time, it's not set in stone. So, you know, so that's something you can continue to do. But it's very important that people are aware, and I would say at the regional councils, that you do kind of have your voice being heard to push it in the right direction.
Robert, you just referred to the French law, the duty of vigilance. And my reading of that law is a bit mitigated because, in my view, it's a way of defining due diligence bottom up, because the enterprises define the commitments to due diligence voluntarily. This means that they can exclude their responsibility if they don't commit to protect these other impacts. So is that really the right way to do?
Oh, it's a good question. And I think there is some concern that the Duty of Vigilance Act did not go far enough, but it was the very first law on this area. And in fact, you are completely right that to some extent the company determines how far it feels that it needs to, or what it needs to include within its concerns. However, there are now a range of cases being brought which are testing companies. For example, there's a couple of cases brought against Total in which Total had sought to exclude things such as climate change, and included, you know, they hadn't talked about some of the actions that's happening in Uganda, and I think that will clarify how far the law can go. But then it's still a significant process in that then it enables a civil claim to be brought, but it doesn't enable a criminal action to be brought under the law.
Thank you.
I don't see any more questions in the chat at the moment, so maybe I would like to loop in Rebecca once more for a question. You mentioned earlier that the Just Transition Fund stimulated the debate to action, and now it's about to really get the action. And there's sort of this very popular criticism about the fund that the total volume is not sufficient given the challenges we have, as well as the governance construction, that it's sort of the plans will be reported through the European semester and there's a lack of inclusiveness. And I was wondering, like, do we have any safeguard mechanisms here as well that you are aware of, or where do you see potential to actually make this really a social just transition plan?
You mean, for example, whether the fund also refers to the taxonomy that was just mentioned, for example?
No, I mean more the just transition plans from at the country level, and that they are sort of handed through the European semester. And like, to my knowledge, this has been criticized to not guarantee the inclusion of all relevant stakeholders, and if there's any plan for a platform or anything to actually guarantee inclusion in this process.
Yeah, that's actually a very relevant aspect, and I mean the question I got earlier already touched on this. So the Just Transition Fund is regulated by the same rules that regulate the cohesion funding of the EU, and the cohesion funding and the Just Transition Fund, they both need to stick to the partnership principle, and that's a principle which obliges member states to include relevant stakeholders in drawing up the programs for spending this money. But of course, I mean, in the Just Transition, and we heard that already in the previous session, that these are very regional processes. So it's the regional actors that know best, like the strengths and weaknesses of the region, what they want it to look like in the future, and that have really the expertise to shape these regional transition strategies. So it's very necessary that all governments stick to this partnership principle and also give a very strong role to regional actors in this process of drawing up the territorial transition strategies.
And do you from your research have already an example of this? Or?
Yeah, I mean, so the processes are just starting. So there were several member states, I think 18, that requested technical assistance from the Commission, which basically means that there are independent consultancies that will support the drawing up of these processes. But for example, there is a Polish region, Greater Poland, where I have heard positive things, where also NGOs are included in the process of discussing the transition strategies. But then the transition strategy, but then there are of course past processes. So some regions in the EU are already a bit further advanced. There's a very good example, and I would call it best practice case from Slovakia, from the lignite region called Upper Nitra. They have developed a transition strategy for the region last year, so it was adopted last year, and that was really driven by the bottom up. So the mayor from a town in that region initiated this process, and then it was later supported by the national government. So there are successful processes that governments can actually look out for when they design these processes now under the Just Transition Fund. Maybe just an additional comment, because you mentioned in the beginning of your question that there has been criticism that the size of the Just Transition Fund is not large enough to support this massive transition effort. And I think it's really important to keep in mind that there are many other funds in the EU budget that are also supportive of the transition. So the Just Transition Fund is really focused on this social part of the transition, so supporting reskilling, for example, the creation of new job opportunities. But when it comes to investments in renewables, for example, then there's the modernization fund. So it's not all, the Just Transition Fund doesn't have to cover all, but the other funds of the EU budget, and then of course the recovery funding, if it's set up right, can also support the transition.
Okay, thank you.
There is an additional question to Robert by Noel Cahill. Will the proposed EU legislation on human rights due diligence apply to retailers? Would they be required to assess the human rights issues along the supply chain of the products they sell?
It's a great question, Noel. It's been at the heart of some of this discussion. Certainly, the study I was involved in, based on our discussions, proposed that the regulation should apply to all companies, no matter whether they're retailers or suppliers or investors or whoever. And that was what came out of our own research. And it seems like the Commission is likely to adopt that approach. But let me clarify that. There's a couple of issues on that. One of which is, well, should this really apply to a small or medium-sized enterprise? Maybe the person who is your local shop, or undertaking maybe something in just a very small instance. And the answer is yes, it will apply to them, with a however. And the however is that it's expected that the demands on them will be much less, and the expectation on them might be less. But it doesn't mean that it doesn't apply to them. Let me give you an example. It's certainly possible for your local shop to be using child labour, to be using products which they haven't actually checked have come from a source which is not a source which would otherwise fit within these requirements. And secondly, they may be part of a supply chain. Many small and medium-sized enterprises are part of a global supply chain where there's a major company involved. And very often in that, the major company might require each of their suppliers to comply with some kind of human rights, environmental due diligence. And the final point I make is that very much there's the expectation that it's meant to go beyond the first tier of suppliers, and that can be very hard for a retailer. I've worked with a number of different companies, but I can give an example which is public. Nestle has 140,000 first tier suppliers. Now that means that they've got a huge number of further tiers, but they have made the commitment that they will look beyond each tier, not least because in the same way when we might go into a shop, we look at the list of ingredients, Nestle is saying we've got to look at where these products are coming from. So that it is hard, but then again, there's a range of laws which do on product liability, on health and safety, which are meant to apply to every retailer for checking how that product has come towards them. So the view is this may not be as difficult as it can appear, but it certainly is going to be demanding, and it certainly applies to retailer. So thank you for the question.
Thank you, Robert, for your answer. Miriam, there is a question from Mia McCarthy for you. Is there a sense at this stage what the social taxonomy might look like?
For the moment, in the sense of, is there an official sense? I'm not sure. Because, for instance, what I've done is I looked at the 3 different sustainability finance laws. It was like, so the taxonomy, how do they there kind of define social? Well, the social minimum guarantee, but the disclosure the sustainability disclosure regulation also kind of gives some definitions, and it's very vague there. It's I looked it up. It was living wages or living income, kind of make sure that there is that inequality is being kind of addressed, fostering social cohesion, labor relations. So officially, we don't have a sense. Of course, there's some persons already trying to work on it. And I think it will need quite some work to come to a consensus for kind of what do we mean? What are the thresholds? What are the screening criteria? And then to look at what kind of sectors it applies, because that's also what the green taxonomy is doing. So there's a huge amount of work. And I say that because if the Commission really wants to do it, they can propose by the end of next year, when they have a report and saying, you know, we think it would be useful to have a social taxonomy, they can already, according to the law, propose kind of what they think a social taxonomy could be. So, and knowing how long it has been taking the green taxonomy discussions and the technical details. So the platform, I think, will start with it. Platform on sustainable finance with some experts in there. But for the moment, I don't think we have a good view. There are people, having ideas and seeing how it works.
Thank you very much, Miriam. That's very useful. I would now like to ask all you panelists a second question. Where do you currently see the largest challenges to achieve climate neutrality in a socially just manner? Maybe Rebecca, you can start.
Sure. So I basically see two challenges. On the one hand, from my work, I observe sort of a lack of political willingness in some cases to develop a clear vision at the national level of where to transition to. Of just transition processes, a central element is that national governments provide guidance by setting, for example, a coal phase-out date and similar timelines, so that regions can adjust their planning to these timelines and plan transition measures. But in many cases in Europe at the moment, so whether it is the German coal phase-out, for example, with an end date of 2038, it's likely that Czechia is also going to copy this phase-out timetable. And this is just not realistic planning because, for example, with coal, it's clear that a phase-out or their decline is coming much earlier. And this is actually a problem for regions because they might not plan accordingly and be affected by very disruptive changes. And then this is more the political challenge, but then there's also a very practical challenge. So with all the recovery money being available now, with the Just Transition Fund, there's simply a lack of capacity at national level, at regional level, to plan for how to use this funding and develop coherent strategies, proposals, instead of just focusing on individual projects. So yeah, this would be it's a political challenge and a practical challenge.
I think one of the challenges now is that one of them being the fact that there's so much focus on climate. So the supervisors, for instance, have what is called the supervisors in the central banks, or regulators in English. They have a network on greening the financial system. And they look at the transition risks being, new environmental laws coming in, or physical risks, like, buildings being hit by storms. And they kind of never really included the whole kind of social dimension. They seem to wake up a little bit now because of COVID, but as their name is saying, it's already not sufficient. But I'm also working with civil society in Asia, and there is much more willingness to combine social and environment. I must say, in Europe, the speeches by Timmermans was, no social or no climate without social, and so on. But in the legal proposals so far, that seems not to have been very strong. There is also a bit of an opposition in the European Union saying we don't have a social mandate. But the new commissioner might be more committed to it. So it's one thing. And secondly, the challenge is very much also from the investors finding it much more difficult to find out social and human rights information than the climate one, because climate one you can quantify. Yeah, you can say so much CO2 and so on. I mean, I'm not saying it's all going well, but it seems easier. And as also from our research, we're finding out it's so difficult to find out on the ground what is really going wrong. Otherwise, sometimes we're sued. They're threatened to be sued if we do. So people are also sometimes in problems when they have to kind of denounce things. So that's where the problem of the investors, some of them are committed, but they have to put the costs and the money and the kind of, the expertise there to undig. And that is a challenge.
May I add something
Sure.
before you take the floor, Robert? Are liability mechanisms such as those which are being considered now by the Commission under the due diligence framework a possible solution to the lack of access to information on social and human rights for investors? Can it help? Sorry, there is an intersection with different questions towards Robert.
Oh, sorry, I thought that was to Miriam.
No.
Well, let me firstly say I completely agree with Miriam's analysis. And in terms of the costing, which picks up your question, Natalie, there's a very good book by Colin Mayer called Prosperity, in which he notes that a lot of these costs, social costs, physical costs of kind of the loss of natural elements are not taken into account at all in most of financial decision making. To give you a rather terrible example, Rio Tinto in Australia dug up a whole range of very important indigenous areas and doesn't even meet anywhere in their financial records because it's just the indigenous people's interest. It's not even rated, and I think that's a concern. And whereas, of course, the potential new EU regulation on mandatory human rights due diligence forces the companies to think about the impacts, doesn't quite force them to think about the costs of those impacts, but at least it turns it from being only about a business risk to an impact. And I think that's a helpful way forward. And also the examples of companies which are really seriously looking at this does show that there are ways forward which enable the closer engagement between social impacts and issues such as linked with climate change. But there is one issue in climate change which is, of course, often raised by companies, which is proving causation. And that has been a problem in law. Interesting enough, once again, there's been a couple of instances where companies have been considered by a body, a supervisory body or otherwise, to say, well, you haven't at least taken it into account. And I think that moves it forward a little bit. But I'm not sure the human rights and environmental due diligence regulation by itself does what you're talking about. But I do think it moves the discussion further along and ensures companies consider these issues more closely than they have at the moment or had reason to at the moment.
Thank you. So, Robert, would you like to add something about the challenges, the largest challenges?
Sorry. Well, some of the challenges are exactly as Rebecca said, political will. Also, often the odd thing that political will, and I've seen this in engaging a lot with governments, they're worried that they don't want to bring in this kind of regulation or whatever because companies won't want it. Whereas I do all the work with companies and show they do want it. And that can be irritating, shall I say. The other element, I think, is that the sense to which thinking of climate change as not just limited to kind of pollution and the kind of, is this going to affect, where there's the ozone layer, but thinking this has social costs. When you cut down trees, actually it impacts on the communities on the ground, and taking those seriously into account. I think pulling those two issues together is a big challenge.
Thank you all for your contributions. I think we have to conclude the session. We are already running over time. And Miriam, you have to leave, aren't you? So maybe if you have a last key message, let us know. All the audiences, please, if you have something you take as a key takeaway from the session, we would be keen to actually, if you just post this in the chat, because we will have the chat, and it would be interesting to see what you considered as a key takeaway. And I would give all of you very briefly the floor for a key takeaway, and maybe give it a start. For me, it's really the need for legal certainty and regulation requested by multiple actors. I think that is sort of that came out in all the discussions. And yeah, thank you all. And maybe Rebecca, you want to continue?
Can I, sorry, because I really have to leave.
Yeah.
I think basically what we did today is to combine, kind of what is needed, and when you have a fund, when the funding is there, what to fund in is very important. And then also getting the details on the social one, being the due diligence, is important. And it seems that at the national level or the EU level, not everything is yet coming together. But it's very important also that we try and stop what is not being sustainable, because that's a big problem for the moment. So yeah, and combine social and climate and environment. That's always my argument. So we have to continue to do so. Thank you very much. Sorry.
Thank you for your input and for being part of this panel.
Thank you very much.
Bye, Miriam.
Bye, Miriam.
Thanks, Miriam.
Okay,
So
I'm
Rebecca,
happy to
maybe
continue.
you want to continue?
Sure. So, I mean, this session is called Finance for a Just Transition. And I think what I took away also from Miriam's and Robert's input is that financing a just transition, it's not sufficient if there's one fund to finance it, but just transition principles really need to become cross-cutting mainstream principle in public funding, in private funding, to ensure that it's the people that benefit from funding and the climate. And thanks for the very good discussion and interesting insights.
If I could just add to that, I learned a great deal. Rebecca and Miriam's information was incredibly helpful in terms of clarifying the depth and the breadth of the idea of just transition, and pulling it so that at the moment, trying to bring these issues together hasn't really worked as effectively as we would like. And hopefully this session shows there are potentials. For example, there's an organization called Principles of Responsible Investment, which only now is beginning to realize to bring together climate change within it. And I think trying to bring these two issues together, I think what I've learned from this session is that they are possible, but there's still quite a way to go in doing that. And so in remembering that there is social impact in climate change, it's not removed from that.
Yes, yeah, thank you. Natalie, how about you?
Yeah, I agree with what Miriam and Robert have said, and I think the idea of a balance between the social and the environment is crucial, and what we see so far is we have many initiatives where the social dimensions has in principle priority. And for example, Rebecca highlighted very clearly that the impacts of the just transition plans on the environment are problematic. So we need to take that into consideration as well. And of course, the other way around is right too. With the taxonomy, there is so far no sufficient taking into consideration of the social dimension. So it's always an issue of the balance that needs to be struck between the social and the environmental dimensions of sustainable development.
Thank you. I think that was the perfect closure for today. We are running over time. Many thanks to our speakers once more, and to you, Natalie, to co-organize this with me. It was
Thank
really
you,
good.
Anna.
And thank you to all the EAC members and colleagues who supported us in this. All right. Have a good afternoon and hope to see you sometime soon.
Thank you. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you, Natalie and Anna.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.